Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Uncharted 2, Among Thieves, originally released for PlayStation 3, but later re-released as part of the Nathan Drake collection on PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the remastered version that's available in the Nathan Drake collection on PS4. This is a third-person action-adventure game and the sequel to Uncharted Drake's Fortune. It was developed by Naughty Dog and published by Sony in 2009 for PlayStation 3, and it later saw a re-release in 2015 in the Nathan Drake collection for PlayStation 4. Now, it is worth noting that the remastered version does not contain the multiplayer component, so I will not be covering that in this particular review, but most people don't even think about multiplayer even existing in the Uncharted series, so that's kind of a moot point anyway. But I digress. This particular game got a massive amount of critical acclaim across the board, and to the point where it's been hailed as one of the greatest video games of all time! Which, as far as I'm concerned, is cause for skepticism. Especially when the previous game was such a mess. So the question really becomes, does Uncharted 2 manage to improve upon what the original game did well and actually expand upon that? Or does it just do more of the same and end up falling into mediocrity like the original game did? Well, let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out. Well, as far as presentation goes, you do have to keep in mind that I am playing the remastered version here, but I did go back and take a look at a side-by-side comparison of the PS4 and the original PS3 versions. The PS4 version has the same level of visual fidelity as, of course, the first Uncharted as well as the third Uncharted remastered, which means that it has rather solid texture work, the modeling is very well done, animations are generally very smooth and fluid, although I did notice several glitches, particularly with regards to reloading, where for some reason you would remove the magazine, and sometimes it would actually remove the magazine, other times it wouldn't, and so it just looked odd. Not to mention numerous clipping errors with certain weapons being used with certain animations, because there is still a lot of animation reuse here, including the same old thing that you saw with the previous Uncharted game, where they modify some of the models to fit their animations, rather than modify their animations to fit the models. Now, obviously, in comparison to the original PS3 release, it looks a lot better, but the original PS3 release actually holds up rather well. It had absolutely fantastic production values for its day, which meant that in its day, it actually had very solid texture work, it had great modeling and animations, and the environment art in particular was just top-notch. And on top of all of that, the lip sync is pretty fantastic as well, so everything actually still looks really good in the PS3 version, despite it being almost a decade since it was released. Now, of course, the one thing that's going to hold up regardless is the sound design, which is generally very well done. The voice acting is, once again, absolutely fantastic. Much like in the previous game, the characters are all portrayed extremely well. There's a lot of humor in the game, which is pretty difficult for actors to pull off, and they still manage to pull it off very well. And the flow of the dialogue is very smooth and natural, which makes the actual character moments rather strong. Sure, the main antagonist of the game is basically one note, and his note is mwahahaha. But unlike in the previous game, that's actually handled quite a bit better, so it doesn't become as much of a problem. Then you move over into the other aspects of the sound design, and you have music that is generally very solid, but unfortunately is fairly generic action-adventure game music. Now, a lot of people complained about me saying that with regards to the first Uncharted, but it holds true here as well. I cannot remember a single track from this game. Or the previous game, for that matter. That is not to say that the music in Uncharted is bad. I think a lot of people mistake me saying it is not recognizable outside of the confines of the game as, my god, music bad. Music is still good. Problem is that if you listen to it outside of the confines of the game, you're probably not going to instantly recognize it as music from Uncharted. It's the kind of thing that works really well in the moment, but you're not going to have a big lasting impression on it. And even worse than that, there's no real recognizable theme. People have told me, oh, it's Drake's theme, which is the main menu music, and only the main menu music. The thing is, if there was a proper theme for the game, it would actually be repeated as a motif throughout the game, not just in the main menu. And that doesn't happen in Uncharted. Meanwhile, you go to something like Indiana Jones, and obviously you have the main theme of the Raiders March, but that is repeated as a motif throughout all of the films. And without that sort of recognizable theme, a bit of the magic is lost. Just a bit. It's not enough to tank the experience or anything, but it is mildly disappointing. Also mildly disappointing are the sound effects themselves. Now, they're not bad by any stretch of the imagination, it's just that they're not particularly amazing either. Gunfire and explosions just doesn't really have enough bass to it, and thus you end up with sound effects that are generally pretty decent, but they don't really have the same kind of oomph that you would really want out of them. This means that while the vast majority of the weapons and explosion sounds don't sound particularly weak, except for the FAL, which sounds really wimpy for some baffling reason, they don't have the kind of punch that you really want out of your weapon and explosion sounds that will kind of rattle the player around a bit and really get them excited. So while they are somewhat disappointing, at least they haven't absolutely tanked the experience or anything. But of course, the presentation isn't everything. What really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is that you take on the role once again of Nathan Drake, who is the thief and treasure hunter. And the game actually starts off in the middle of the plot because Nathan is sitting in a train that is hanging off of a cliff and he is severely wounded and you're trying to climb around the train trying to get off of it before it falls off of the edge of the cliff. So that, of course, instills the question of, wait a minute, what the hell happened? Why is he in this state? What's going on? Where is he? And all that sort of thing, which then cuts to a flashback where it was several months prior to those events, and he is setting up a deal with Harry Flynn and Chloe Fraser in order to steal a Mongolian lamp from a Turkish museum and double-cross their employer in that regard. Because it turns out that it's related to Marco Polo's lost expedition, and they want to go and find that and the possible treasure that it comes with. Needless to say, things don't necessarily go according to plan, and he finds out that they were working for a guy named Zoran Lazarevic, who has a comically huge amount of resources available to him, and he is absolutely hell-bent on finding the Centimani stone, which is the main treasure associated with Marco Polo's voyage. It's rumored to be a massive sapphire that supposedly came from Shambhala, which is better known by most people as Shangri-La. But anyway, the main plot of the game does center around going after the Centimani stone and trying to get to it before Lazarevic does. To that end, you'll run into a cast of characters, both new and from the previous game as well, and all of them play their roles very well. In fact, Lazarevic, despite being kind of a mwah-ha-ha-ha sort of antagonist, actually doesn't end up being like the villains in Uncharted 1, for example, where they were saying some pretty cringy lines. Here he doesn't say anywhere near as many cringy lines, and he's more believable, at least until the end of the game, in which case everything just kind of goes off the rails anyway. But of course that's partly the problem, because the game does go off the rails, and it even goes off the rails toward the beginning as well. It seems to think it's being clever by working in betrayals and supposed betrayals and such of that nature, but in reality it actually just gets rather tiresome. Numerous plot points become very predictable, and it becomes really wrapped up in the spectacle of things rather than any real substance behind them. Now, it's not necessarily a terrible thing, it just means that you're going to be focused more on the character moments than on the actual plot, because the plot itself ends up being somewhat ridiculous. And luckily, the character moments are enough to salvage the actual writing aspects, because the dialogue is very well done this time around, and certainly compared to the previous game, and on top of that you have the fantastic voice acting to go along with it. There's quite a lot of humor packed into everything, and you really can get attached to several of these characters and go, okay, yeah, I really like these people because they're funny and they're interesting and they've obviously got some history going on and things like that. And most of the time that is enough to keep the thing moving along, but unfortunately when the plot rears its ugly head, it ends up being something that actually drags the game down a bit. With that said, it is a better plot than what you had in the original Uncharted, and it is a bit more Indiana Jones-esque. It does capture that feeling a bit better, but unfortunately, it's not the writing that really drags this thing down. It's the gameplay, which is almost exactly the same as the original Uncharted, which means that the combat system is absolutely bare bones. This is a third-person cover-based shooter with some of the most rudimentary shooting you will ever see in a third-person shooter. You have a slot for pistols and you have a slot for your primary weapon. Your primary weapon is going to be something like a shotgun or an assault rifle or a sniper rifle or something of that nature, and the pistol can be either a semi-automatic, a revolver, or a fully automatic machine pistol. And for most of the enemies, a single headshot is enough to bring them down, unless they're wearing a helmet, in which case you have to knock the helmet off first, and then you can get them down with a single headshot. Otherwise, it takes numerous body shots to bring an enemy down. Unless, of course, you're using certain weapons like the Desert Eagle or the sniper rifle, which generally speaking will take an enemy down in a single hit. Unless they're one of the bullet sponge enemies. You see, in an effort to make the combat more difficult, Naughty Dog decided it would be a good idea to put enemies in this game that can take numerous grenades and rockets to the face and still be perfectly fine. And they tend to mix these enemies in with a bunch of normal enemies that will also shoot you to pieces. Even on the normal difficulty, you die relatively quickly in this game, which means that fighting these bullet sponge enemies, particularly when you're fighting them in the midst of numerous other enemies, is downright infuriating. Before they start introducing the bullet sponge enemies, the combat system is very basic, but at least it works, and it's not something that's outright irritating. Once you get to the bullet sponge enemies, everything gets worse. Because this game throws a lot of combat at you, enough that you might as well call it a third-person shooter more than an action-adventure game. And with the combat system being so basic, you only have 2 weapon slots and then you have a button to lob grenades at things, you have a game that is not really giving you a lot of options for combat. You're just gonna go with whatever you happen to have ammo for at any given point, and you're gonna try to prioritize the strongest weapons in the game just so you don't have to deal with the bullet sponges as much. To make matters more annoying, the enemies will throw grenades at you in order to try to flush you out of cover, which is certainly fine. I mean, you would expect them to do that if their AI is anything remotely resembling intelligent. The problem is that they do it a lot. And with the amount of damage you can take being relatively low in this thing, it means that the combat just becomes this tedious slog of going to a location, trying to take cover, getting flushed out of cover, and then just getting mowed down almost instantly by the dozen or so enemies that you're fighting at that point, probably several of which have shotguns and just take you down in 1 or 2 hits. You'll almost certainly get to the point where you absolutely dread fighting things just because it's going to bog the entire experience down for several minutes. And to make matters worse, they actually made the melee system even more basic than it already was. In the original game, you had 2 combos. You had your basic mash the square button combo, and then you had the brutal combo, which was square, triangle, square. Here, there is only the mash square combo, only at some point the enemy will start fighting back and then you have to press the triangle button just to counter them, and then you can finish them off with another square. And unlike in the original game, you do not get double ammunition for doing this. Which of course means that the melee system in this game is completely pointless. There is absolutely no incentive whatsoever to run up and start using the melee system unless you're just completely out of ammo, which is actually pretty difficult to do because this game gives you more ammo than the previous one did. All you're doing if you try to use the melee combat system is opening yourself up to getting mowed down by machine gun fire, because that's exactly what is going to happen. Because it's not like you're rendered invincible while you're doing the melee system. Oh no, you're still getting shot to pieces while you're doing it, so there is literally no reason to have the melee combat system in this game at all. Which of course means that combat-wise, you are left with an extremely bare-bones third-person cover-based shooter that is really just not a very good third-person shooter. What is the rest of the gameplay? Well, it consists of either running away from something where the camera angle is probably in a position where you cannot see where you're going, which is of course always fun, because if you manage to screw up that bit, then you die and you have to start all over again. Or you're doing the platforming, which is rather simplistic, but it generally works very well, so kudos to them for at least having a platforming system that is not garbage. Although, to be fair, it is about the same as the one in the original Uncharted, which means that sometimes the controls can be a bit finicky, but most of the time it works out fine. And then, of course, there's the occasional puzzle solving, but the game gives you all of the solutions right there in the journal, so that's really not puzzle solving so much as it is just following the instructions that you're given. And they even threw in a few QTEs, but luckily those are very few and far between. They only come up a couple of times in the game, and thankfully they're very brief. But all of that put together means that on the gameplay side of things, this thing is extremely deficient. It becomes painfully obvious very quickly that the game was mainly centered around its presentation aspects. The fantastic voice acting aside, it is a pretty game to look at, and there are some really impressive action set pieces that are really cool to look at. The problem being that the game just doesn't have the gameplay to back all of that up. The platforming is pretty decent, and a couple of the puzzles would be clever if the game just didn't outright tell you what the solution was. But beyond that, you have a very mediocre third-person shooter, and everything else is just trying to put forth an action set piece that really doesn't work very well. It ends up becoming almost all flash and barely any substance. All of the substance is in the character moments, and luckily those are very well done, and they're mostly enough to salvage the game, but that doesn't shake the fact that the gameplay is often boring or outright infuriating in the case of the combat system. You have to remember, this is a video game. It is not a movie. If it were a movie and all you had to do was watch it, then it'd probably be fine. But this is a video game. Video games are meant to be played, not watched. And when you bring everything together, the best this game manages to be is just underwhelming. It does not remotely live up to the hype, and now I am utterly convinced that the only reason this entire series became popular is because gamers are impressed with shiny things. Well, I hate to break it to you, but high production values do not automatically make the game good. And in this case, it's a real shame because there is quite a bit of heart behind it. It's just that all of that heart is in the presentation aspects, and the gameplay suffers horribly as a result, making the entire experience a 2.5 out of 5. It's certainly a better game than the original Uncharted, I will definitely give it that, but that's really not saying all that much. The original Uncharted was a mess, and this one is still a mess, just a bit less of a mess. But that said, it being a bit improved over the original game does give me hope for later games in the series to improve upon things more, so we'll go ahead and keep taking a look at the rest of the series and see what exactly we're dealing with. But as for Uncharted 2, I really can't recommend it unless you get it for a really cheap price. Because after the boundless hype this thing has received, when you actually play this incredibly underwhelming title, you're going to go, wow, that was disappointing. Thanks for watching.